My name is Alice Chilvers, and I'm the founder and CEO of WEN. That is an organization that I founded 10 years ago or so, whilst I was working at UCL. And we exist to accelerate progress towards gender equality in the sector. In fact, at the event we were meant to be having yesterday, I was going to announce our big ambition, which is to deliver gender equality in the sector in the next 10 years by representation. So obviously achieving gender equality in its truest sense is complex. And unfortunately, I think it will take many more years than 10. However, I think it's entirely possible that we can achieve equal numbers of women represented in senior leadership roles across the sector in 10 years. The sector is not that far off compared to other sectors, and we are the place that generates knowledge. So if we can't do it, what other sectors can? So that's why WEN exists to accelerate progress. We don't want to be talking to our grandchildren about the same gender inequality issues that we face today, so we want to accelerate progress. The thing is, if we always do what we've always done, things aren't going to change that much faster. Obviously, things across the sector have changed dramatically over the past several decades, but progress remains slow. And when we talk about gender equality, some women are benefiting massively from this, and some women are being left behind. So, for example, in 2019, Nicola Rollock published a report called Staying Power, and it highlighted the fact that there were only 25 Black women professors across the entire UK higher education sector. And just to put that into perspective, at that time, there were 13,000 white men professors and 25 Black women professors. So at that time, WEN had existed as an organization for 5 years. I had become a mother, and my time was more precious than ever. And although things were going well at WEN, I was asking myself, are we really accelerating progress in the sector? Are things really going to be different as a result of what we've been doing? And the answer, unfortunately, was no. Yes, we were bringing them together. Yes, we were having good conversations about careers, but things weren't fundamentally going to be different as a result of what we had been doing so far. So I was asking myself if we could focus on a very small number of key things that would actually make a difference, what would they be? And that coincided with me reading Nicola Rollock's report, Staying Power, which highlighted the fact there were only 25 Black women professors in the sector. And there was no doubt in my mind that that wasn't due to a lack of ambition or talent. There are obviously systemic barriers at play that are preventing all women from succeeding. So yeah, so that's the origins of WEN. So 10 years ago, I was working full time at UCL at the time. I left UCL as Director of Organizational Development, moved to Oxford University in the same role. And 2 years ago, I left my job, my full-time stable job at Oxford University to work full-time on WEN, because there's nothing I'd rather be doing with my precious time now than shifting the dial on this agenda. Do you want me to tell you a bit more about the 100 Black Women Professors now, Joe, and kind of what happened after that?
Yeah, please, that would be great.
Okay, so in 2019, the report Staying Power got published, and I was the director of organizational development at UCL at the time. Now, I'd read, you know what it's like working in the sector, especially you guys in comms roles. There'll be lots of reports coming your way with new data, new research that's happened. Um, Sometimes interesting, sometimes shocking. I read this report and I was shocked. And I knew full well that other people across the sector would be shocked, but I also knew that it's very likely that nothing might change as a result of it. We read these reports and I sort of describe them as frisbees. They sort of appear on our desks. It was like, oh, what was that for a few minutes? And then everyone carries on with what they've always been doing. So I happened to read this report at a time when I was asking, what can we do at WEN that would really make a difference? And my background before the higher education sector is in private sector leadership consultancy. I worked for a private sector company that specialized in aligning people and culture with strategy, and we worked with the top 100 leaders of big multinational organizations. It was very, very good quality stuff. And so when I came to the sector, I brought with me the knowledge and insights about how to do that stuff really well, how to get leaders aligned around a particular issue, really engaged, wanting to deliver change, and then actually accountable for delivering it. By that time, I'd worked in the sector for about 8 years, and I understood the nuance and complexity that it would take to deliver real change in the sector as well. And so, having read the reports, I started quickly talking to Black academic women about their lived experiences and whether developing some kind of systemic change program they think would make a difference, and whether that would have made a difference to them earlier in their careers. What I didn't say so far is this report was brilliant, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend you do. It's still entirely relevant. And I'll drop a link to the in the chat to it actually before I leave the call. So this report it highlighted the fact that there were only 25 Black women professors in the sector, and it also interviewed 20 out of those 25 Black women professors. It interviewed them, Nicola Rollock interviewed them to find out about their experiences. What had it been like navigating their careers and achieving professorship in the sector? And the report then had, of course, plenty of recommendations about what Black women academics needed to change, what their departments and line managers needed to change, what the institutions needed to change, and of course, to what needed to happen across the sector. And just coming back, that's the bit where I was like, all these reports fly around, there's recommendations everywhere, but nothing really seems to change. So I began talking to people about whether they thought that a systemic change program could really make a difference, and the answer was yes. The first Black woman professor that I spoke to was Marcia Wilson, who was at that time at the University of East London. And I said, basically, would this have made a difference? Should we do it? Do you think the sector would get on board with it? And the answer from her was yes, yes, yes. And so we went about designing this truly systemic change program because there's nothing wrong with Black women. There's nothing wrong with Black women academics. There are problems, deep fundamental problems with the system. So we created this systemic change program and we launched the pilot in 2021. On the pilot, there were 25 Black women academics participating. And what they experienced was deep support, looking within themselves and finding confidence and clarity about what they wanted and how they could achieve that. They experienced deep clarity around the promotions processes and systems and criteria within their own universities so that they could navigate those really well. But really importantly, we also worked with the senior leaders, so the vice chancellor, the senior leadership team. We had sponsors and allies all engaged on the program, helping those senior leaders understand themselves better. And with that sense of self, empowering them to take more brave and courageous action to actually change systems around them. That 2021 cohort graduated in 2022, and from that cohort, 85% of the women have been promoted, and 8 of them are now professors. So I'm just saying that to, I suppose, yeah, end the story almost to sort of explain that what we found is that we don't have to accept the current pace of progress, the current pace of change. We can absolutely accelerate progress and change the status quo. Today in the sector, we count 108 Black women professors. So the number of Black women professors has, more than tripled in just a few years. They've not all come through our program, but we know the power of focusing on a sector-wide target of 100 has been quite important. So the program was called 100 Black Women Professors Now, because that's what we were seeking to do, to get the sector to 100 Black women professors within 5 years, which we achieved. Just yesterday, sorry, just to backtrack a second, 100 Black women professors is not nearly enough. It's way more than 25, of course, but it's not nearly as many as there ought to be. So we set the target of 100 so that we could be clear, be specific, um, um, set a goal that we believed was entirely realistic and achievable. And now we've achieved that. So the question is, what next? So just yesterday at our annual summit, we announced our next goal for the sector, which is to get the sector to 1,000 Black women professors in post, which is more along the lines of how many there ought to be, given how many Black women of working age live in the UK and what proportion of academics are professors. So we've achieved the first goal, but the work has just begun. We've got the formula now, we know it works, and it's really important that we extend this work across the sector if we want to reap the full benefits of a diverse and inclusive society, which I'm sure all of us on this call very much do.
That's great, Alice. Well done on achieving and contributing to that goal. Just something you said earlier about, I guess, some of the barriers, I think, from a kind of media's perspective as a journalist, when you're kind of looking for experts, you're often looking for somebody who, can deliver and, will perform well in, whether that's a written piece or in broadcast, and press officers also want to kind of put forward people. So sometimes you get a bit of a sort of circle of somebody who's been used before, and it's really hard for kind of others to kind of come in. So I'm just sort of thinking about barriers that also um, kind of affect us in media. We may go back to the same people and get the same people back, and that it's hard for others to kind of break in if they have other barriers also in place. But yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons there, I think, for, I guess, achieving goals. And interesting that you'd had the kind of, I guess, training in private sector as well, and then applying this into a model that I think now you might even be able to expand to different groups, whether that's women who are neurodiverse or women with disabilities, Muslim women. You could actually now use your method for other groups, which I think's really exciting too. Um, I wondered from something that we discussed before, you talked about as part of your program talking to wider members of staff, kind of not just, one of the women you're working with, you'll talk to people within the university who might be a line manager or even higher, or VC. So how do you kind of engage with them in a way that sort of brings them along with your aims, and you're not just talking at somebody, and they feel really involved in building a kind of more equitable system?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the hardest part of the program, to be honest. And I would say, I talk about the 100 Black Women Professors Now program. What the program is and how it actually stitches together changes. It evolves year on year according to what we learn. And according, some things obviously work really well. We do more of those. Some things don't quite get the traction we need. So we rethink those and try again. And the part of the program which involves supporting and enabling Black women academics is very straightforward. And that's the part that, really draws on my experience from the private sector, but also it's co-created with Black women coaches who really understand the sector very well, understand the interdisciplinary experiences of the cohort as well. So that part goes really well every time. The part that is more difficult is the part that we're trying to deliver around systemic change. And I would say this is kind of in two parts. One is around the leaders that we work with, so the line managers, the members of the senior leadership team, etc. And then the other part is around the promotion system itself. And we've decoupled them over the years because we recognize that by focusing separately on the promotion system, it makes it less personal almost, which is easier almost for the institution for us to work with the institutions on. It's easy to talk about systemic change, and I think everyone quite likes to talk about the fact that, oh, we need to change the system. But do you know what? There is no system. We are all the system. It's all people that make up the system and the decisions that people make. So I feel like talking about systemic change is almost being an excuse to slow down progress because it's like, oh, yes, it's a systemic problem, isn't it? So big and overwhelming. Well, no, it's not. We need to break it down and we need to separate that out amongst what it means. So that's what we've done by pulling out all elements to do with promotion and trying to deliver transparency when it comes to promotion and progression. But coming back to your point around line managers and senior leaders, why it's so difficult. Well, the work we do with them has evolved over the years because we're trying to make the impact greater and greater. And why it's difficult is because I think most people would consider themselves to be an ally. So someone who might not have lived experience, but believes in the greater good, believes in equality, and would of course want to support the progression of other colleagues. But I think the challenge is that true allyship is more than being supportive. I think, in our sector, you should expect senior leaders to be supportive. Of course, like why wouldn't you be supportive? But allyship is about much more than support. It's almost like about agitation. You have to disrupt the status quo. It has to probably feel a bit uncomfortable if you're really stretching and changing the status quo. And I don't think many senior leaders, well, let me rephrase that. We've worked with a lot of senior leaders who don't seem to quite get that, who don't seem to quite, they're very up for supporting. But as our colleague Deborah Husbands, who is meant to be on this call, describes, Black women don't need more mentorship. They really need sponsorship in its truest form. They don't need more advice, more suggestions. They actually need opportunities for them. They need doors opening. And that's exactly, the kind of thing that this partnership between WEN and the conversation and Universal Impact is going to create more very specific and direct opportunities to leverage the voices of Black women across the sector. Yeah, I'm just thinking whether I've answered your question fully enough. So, what we actually do with the leaders today, because it's evolved over time. So, what we do with the leaders today is we create a very, very, very safe environment for them. And we bring them together in very small groups and create the conditions for them to be themselves and to look deeply within themselves about what's going on and think deeply about what they could actually do using their power and using their authority that feels uncomfortable to them, but will actually change the status quo, not only for the individual woman that they've been paired with on this cohort, but for all of the women that will come after them. So that's the work today. That's how the work we do with the senior leaders, the sponsors, the allies has evolved today to creating that very safe space. So you won't find when turning up with PowerPoints about imposter syndrome or privilege, we create the conditions for senior leaders to feel very safe so that they can really think deeply about what they can actually do that will make a difference. So
Do you,
hopefully that answers your question, Joe.
yeah, so I was just thinking, thinking about seniority. Do you and this idea of imposter syndrome. So I'll probably go on to that. So Deborah's a reader in race and sociocultural psychology, if I get that right, at Westminster. And she's a leading expert on imposter syndrome. Now, we obviously all kind of have heard about that, maybe felt it in our lives. And it obviously comes up for a lot of people, and particularly and in her research, minoritized academics. And it comes up a lot in events and forums that I've been to. And she says that she prefers to kind of flip it around to kind of talk about belonging or mattering. She's got various sort of descriptions and thoughts attached to those particular
Hmm.
words. Um, but this idea that do we do how much power do we need to kind of have in order to make those changes in what we're doing ourselves, as you said, Alice. um you know us and colleagues, do we need to feel we have power as well, and we're not in a position where we kind of um almost have our own imposter syndrome as well? How do we kind
Mm.
of admit to that and overcome that and feel powerful to kind of make changes in our own roles?
Well, yeah, so this is one thing that I've learned from Deborah Husbands, who's an alumni of the 100 Black Women Professors Now program. And she's a good example of someone who should absolutely be a professor by now, but she isn't quite yet. And I've talked to her a lot about it, and we think, ironically, it's because she's suffering from imposterism, and she very clearly rejects the idea of imposter syndrome. But if you talk to, I think most women now quite familiar with the concept of imposter syndrome, and you know, and we might have felt it, and I think it's fairly common language now. Presumably, a lot of men also familiar with that terminology. Drop in the chat and let me know. Specific events targeted at women, it is a common thing that will be discussed and recognized. But Deborah, you know, she was the first person that alerted me to the fact that actually that's a false concept. Imposter syndrome is not a syndrome, because syndrome language is really important because, there's nothing wrong with individuals. Um, this is about the conditions and the environment that have been created over time, which leads some people to feeling inferior, or less able to cope, or less able to thrive, or less able to be themselves. It leads to feelings of anxiety, perfectionism, also procrastination, low self-worth, all of these feelings. The idea that someone is overworking to prove their legitimacy, they are all features of the imposter phenomenon. That's how Deborah Husbands would describe it. And I would say, yes, absolutely. Deborah Husbands is a world leading expert on this. And I only found out about this different way of thinking about it, which makes total sense through getting to know Deborah. And I suppose, coming back to your earlier point, Joe, there's loads of brilliant Black women academics who are working on brilliant things across the sector. But unless you get to know different people, you don't get to know about their brilliance. And it's through building those relationships that you see how you could platform their stories. I mean, you all know that already. I suppose I was coming back to your comment, Joe, about your equivalent little black books of the people that you always go to because you know that they're going to, perform really well and be really convincing with their messages. Um, I suggested that Deborah joined the panel today because I know she has something really important to say, and I know that you won't have met her before. Because in fact, even a couple of weeks ago, I turned on Radio 4 and there was a radio show being played, and it was very senior. Heard that on the radio, and I thought you could have done that slot. And she said, "Yeah, I know. It's that same woman. She always does the slot every single time, and people just don't know about Deborah." So anyway, I digress. I think I'm talking now about the Little Black Book and access to brilliant people who can share these sorts of stories. But yeah, Deborah was the one that opened my ideas to the idea that imposter syndrome isn't a thing; it's actually imposter phenomenon, and it particularly affects women, and it particularly affects Black women and women with other intersectional experiences.
Yeah, and
What Deborah says, sorry, Joe, I was just going to come like answer your question properly. What Deborah says is that, yeah, the systems have to be worked on and changed. But for an individual, you have to look after yourself and look after your well-being and focus on yourself. And that's the sort of reality. You can't expect for you can't expect, and nor would she expect you to get involved in the big systems change around it, but to focus on you and who you are and what is important to you and your own well-being, whilst recognizing it's not you. It's not you.
yeah. So I was at a recent event and there were a lot of people kind of, sort of building confidence, saying, you've made it to here. You're not somebody who's lacking in something, despite all the kind of barriers you may have faced to get to that place in the first place. You kind of need to change the perspective and say, I've made it here because I deserve to be here.
Yeah.
I'd be quite interested in the women that come onto your program. Do you kind of still see that manifesting a sort of idea that am I still supposed to be here?
Totally, totally. Yesterday, we held this big event. Well, we didn't actually. We've postponed it to September, but we held a short version online. And in the short online version, we heard from stories from 4 women alumni from the 100 Black Women Professors Now program. So there was a somebody who joined the program as a PhD candidate and has now secured her first job in the sector at Oxford. She was sharing her story, and it was just, crazy unbelievable, because she was explaining how she'd, graduated with a first class honors in her undergraduate not a fully funded scholarship for her master's and, graduated from that with distinction, then moved on to do her fully, she's basically a genius. And she was saying how, early on in those phases, and when she hated giving presentations, she dreaded it, she was full of self-doubt. She would be crying in the toilets, before having to do something like that, a presentation in front of colleagues. She was just, scared and intimidated. And now she was describing how she described the turning point as being part of the 100 Black Women Professors Now program and being surrounded by the Black women and all of other great things that come with it. And what was amazing is that she was saying that she's just recently completed her PhD Viva, which lasted 3 hours. And she said it felt to her like it was 20 minutes. She didn't want it to end. She had such a positive experience. And that was just one example of her saying how actually she now loves presenting. And I'm just, giving you that example because, we're talking about professors and we're talking about, the part of the career journey when you're very senior, but actually it starts right at the beginning and it's prevalent throughout. And there's an example of a PhD candidate who is now, employed at the early stages of her career in the sector, but, is transformed in terms of the way that she views her own abilities, her own capabilities, and will hopefully go on to thrive and not be limited because of that from now. There's other, one of the last speakers at the event is also yesterday. She's now become a professor. Professor Sabrina Germain from City St George's University. She's a professor of law there. And she was describing how she's found her voice. Like she was afraid before to say what she really thought in different contexts, and now she's not. Now she uses her voice to say what she thinks, and she believes in her, in what she says is going to be relevant and important in different environments. And by the way, she is a good example of someone who would be brilliant in the media, representing the sector. She'd be brilliant. She's so articulate. And I know that's what you'd be looking for, very safe bets, absolutely no question that this person is going to, shine, represent the university, the domain, the sector really well. And I can tell you, I know loads of women that I could introduce you to who would do you proud. So yes, it's very much there across the women we meet at all the different stages, and it always surprises me when I meet very senior women and they talk about imposter syndrome. But I can almost guarantee that every senior woman that I meet will still talk about imposter syndrome. And now I need to know to correct them.
It'd be good to know from attendees, I guess how I'd be just interested to know how easy or difficult it is to kind of showcase a new person and bring them into your kind of communications work or strategy. Just flipping back to the over-mentored and under-sponsored, just to say that the mentorships we're doing is kind of really to develop an idea and introduce people to what media work entails, what building a profile entails, some of the things that you may have to sort of deal with as well, like online harassment and things like that. So I think
Mm,
it just sort of really develops idea and confidence in sort of taking that next step into kind of more public, a more public forum. But yeah, so Deborah sort of thinks of there being kind of coaches, sponsors, and then advocates, and she sort of sees you as an advocate in this space. Is that the same as an ally, or are they slightly different? But she sees you as an advocate because you're, I guess you're not just supporting, you're creating these programs, you're spotlighting people, and doing all this work. And maybe you could just tell us about how you personally feel as in that role as advocate. I know you're obviously a woman, but you're not a black woman. But then also, if you run programs for different groups, I don't, you are advocating for them. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that and what we might kind of learn ourselves if we were to do that, and how we can kind of what we can do to create more agency. So again, Deborah sort of talks about sponsoring, mentoring, coaching, but the thing that you want to build in somebody is their own agency
mm,
to
mm,
move forward, and to really speak for themselves and not really need that personally anyway, eventually.
mm, mm. Yeah, so when I founded When 10 years ago, it was with this intention of accelerating gender equality um, um, for all women. It was kind of, it was clear to me that it was for all women. But when I first became aware that I needed to think very proactively if I'm talking about all women, it was when at that time, when I was working at UCL, I had started working with a black woman who is now a professor, actually. It was her inaugural lecture on Wednesday evening this week at UCL. She's called Professor Victoria Shumney, if any of you are at UCL or not and might know of her. So I was working with her at the time on a leadership program at UCL. She was a leadership expert and still is. So I was working with her in that capacity. As I was meeting her, I was really excited to tell her that we're setting up this network for women at UCL and it's going to be really diverse. And what advice does she have for us to kind of help make sure it is diverse? And she said, Alice, she was kind of like, Alice, it's not going to be diverse. It's going to be full of women that look exactly like you. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And then I thought about it for a second. And when, there was a co-founder, and yeah, she's right. The co-founder looks exactly like me. We're identical. Emma Todd, if any of you know, work at UCL too. So first of all, I realized that. And then I sort of sat with it for a bit. And then one thing led to another. And we'd got to the point where we were welcoming staff from across UCL to join us as volunteers as we set up the Women's Network. And sure enough, the women that came forward were white women, young white women, well, similar age, white women, who, didn't look too different from me. But they were certainly weren't that diverse. And I was working with Victoria regularly by that time, and I remember talking to her about it again. And she helped me realize very early on my racial identity, which I hadn't really been aware of until that time. I hadn't thought of myself as a white woman. I've just thought of myself as a woman. But she, by very explicitly saying, your network is going to be full of white women that look exactly like you, kind of quite opened my eyes to that reality. And then I saw it happening. So when at that time we were building Australia at UCL, but we took very deliberate action to invite diverse women into the network so that it wouldn't become this thing for white women. But Victoria's point was that initiatives, gender equality initiatives, and initiatives for women had tended to benefit white women, but other women hadn't really seen themselves as part of those communities. If I fast forward to a few years later, when I had read Nicola Rollock's report and had become aware that there were only 25 Black women professors in the sector at that time, we then did a little bit more digging to understand. So we downloaded the HESA data and we created some data sets so that we could see exactly how many Black women professors there were, as well as how many Asian women professors there were, white women professors, and etc. And we created this graph, and I kid you not, you could see so clearly on that graph how gender equality initiatives had massively benefited white women in the sector because you could see the numbers of white women professors like having this, really lovely. It's what if you were trying to, change anything you'd hope for. It was this lovely gradient of white women professors year on year. They're becoming more and more white women professors, and obviously something really significant was changing across the sector. But on the same graph, we plotted racially minoritized women professors in the sector, and they were like, flatlined right at the bottom, this tiny, tiny proportion, like less than 1%. And so, yeah, putting it visually on that graph was yeah, very interesting to see. But what it made me realize without doubt is that when we talk about gender equality and we talk about sort of initiatives to support women, they haven't really been designed very intentionally for all women, not explicitly, not deliberately. And when I set out the ambition of accelerating gender equality in the sector, it wasn't gender equality for white women, it was for all women. And so so I suppose that, early intervention from Victoria Shumney, Professor Victoria Shumney, together with, the significance of understanding the data at that point of Nicola Rollock's report coming out, really helped me to understand that, you couldn't just do stuff for gender equality or do women's initiative and it it naturally benefit all women proportionately. So that sense of inclusion and all women was very, very important to me. My personal, I realize now, many years later, that I have this very core and strong personal value around inclusion. Like would not want anyone to be excluded. I would not want Black women to be excluded from the gender equality initiative in the sector, but seems to be what's happened according to the data. So I also, the other thing that happened to me is I became a mother. And when I became a mother, in 2019, I felt this shift in me around the preciousness of my own time. And at that time, I was working at Oxford University and I was the director of the People and Organizational Development function there. The majority of my time was spent justifying the business case for the existence of my department. And I was spending a lot of time in committee meetings where not much was getting done. So I felt like a big proportion of my time was not being used that effectively. And certainly I was sort of limited in how much change I could really deliver. And so and so that's kind of all, what led to me saying, well, actually, my time is really, really precious. I'm not here to deliver programs, to host a network. I'm here to really change the status quo in the sector. So therefore, what are the few things I could do that would make a difference? So that was all kind of, background information to why I suppose I am doing advocacy work now because I don't just want to go with the flow. I want to change the status quo, and that is what is required in order to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. If anyone has any questions about, I guess, how you do this work, there's obviously a lot to fit in, and there's a whole kind of discussion you could have about data as well. But if you would like to kind of raise your hand or post a question, we can have a look at that now.
I just wanted to add one other thing, which is because you asked Joe, what can the people on this call do, and kind of where is there an opportunity to help? And there is having worked with now 180 Black women academics across the sector over the past 4 years, there's a definite theme around comms and messaging, which I really think I hope that we will uncover more in the work we will do together, Joe. But what I found is that many of the people we've worked with can't articulate what their thing is. So I'm asking them, okay, you've done all this amazing work, but what's your thing? Like, what's the one thing that everyone's going to know you for, that you're really going to be like delivering change on in this world? And I find that they find it very hard to articulate that because obviously a lot of the things they're doing are so broad and so complex. And I think that there's a real need for comms professionals like you to help particular staff to be able to very clearly articulate their thing. And then once they've got over that particular barrier, their voices can be heard widely and loudly. And of course, that visibility and getting the message out there is a very, very important part of promotions criteria. So without being able to do that, they are limited insofar as the evidence that they can gain, which will count towards promotion when they are ready.
Uh, there is a question from Susanna. Very interesting thoughts. I'm lucky enough to work with Deborah at the University of Westminster. Shout out. I was wondering if Alice experiences imposter syndrome herself and how she personally deals with it and how it has changed since you became a mum.
Yeah, well, so as if Deborah was here, she would want me to be rejecting the idea of imposter syndrome, remember, and saying, yes, I recognize the imposter phenomenon around me. And
I think you would say you're not sick.
Um, what Deborah would say is that, if you recognize imposter phenomenon, it's a signal that something is wrong with the environment around you. But yeah, I mean, the first time I said, "Oh, this is me experiencing the imposter phenomenon." Was when I got a phone call about a job, and I was basically being offered a job, and I hung up the phone and I called my husband and I was like, "Oh, I don't think the person really knows who I am and what I've done." Like I thought that she thought that I was more capable than I thought that I was myself. Anyway, it was a definite first, moment where I really truly felt like an imposter. And now, I recognize more and more some of the reasons for that. But yes, I certainly have felt it. Then that was a very specific first time. Since I've become a mother, I don't, since I've become a mother, things have changed for me. But in a way that I suppose I couldn't quite anticipate and didn't quite expect, but I recognize it. And it's because it's because I have so little time. I mean, my time is squeezed. I mean, I work all the time. I wish I worked less hard, but I feel like my time is very precious because my children are so young. So I feel like there's this rush to do my job really, really well and not waste any time for it to be super impactful so that I can try and have some kind of balance and not miss these early years with my children. So I think what's changed for me is um, a, a sort of sense of urgency actually around change that needs to be delivered in the sector through the work that I do. And perhaps I probably take on a little bit more responsibility than I ought to. But, but that's what's changed for me. Like I don't want to be working 9 to 5 and not be with my children to shuffle some papers around and defend some silly, idea in a big committee meeting. I want to be working 9 to 5 on actually shifting the dial on something really meaningful that really matters. So that's what's definitely shifted for me since I became a mother. And thanks, thanks for your
Um,
self-correction around phenomena.
there's one more question. Do you have any other tips on diversifying academic voices in the media? What actually works apart from defining what's your thing? Um, I would just say on the diversifying academic voices, this is from Lucia Graves. If you want to get in touch, I can tell you more about Still We Rise. But yeah, sort of, I guess the what's your thing does kind of focus um, minds on what you can talk about and move you forward. I think in terms of, when we have people writing, there's so much in there, and we also follow a kind of, okay, what's the main thing you want to say, and then lead into the other points from that. So it's
Mm.
interesting. There's a sort of similarity, even though it's a completely different sort of thing.
Yeah, I think as well. I mean, it sounds simple, but I think spending time with different people, like so getting to know different people that you wouldn't ordinarily know, because that then builds your confidence in who they are and what they've got to say and how reliably they'll show up. I mean, there's so many women that I know now really well, and I believe that they are brilliant leaders and will go on to do even more impactful things throughout their careers. And partly that comes from, knowing them and getting to know them personally beyond the sort of job title and stuff. But also when I see someone and I think, oh, you're going to be an amazing leader, it's often because they're very articulate. I see them able to articulate themselves well with other people. I see them able to articulate their ideas and contributions academically really well. And so I imagine them being able to be really good leaders because they're able to build really good alignment and engagement with other people. So I think, the quality of being able to communicate is hugely important. But I think that um, and I think that a route in is very simply spending time with different people and hearing them talk in environments where they're comfortable, so that you can see their capability more specifically. And I know that takes time, and I know we don't have any time. But for instance, a few months ago, I went to the University of West England's it was African History Month, oh sorry, Black History Month, and they had the African Society had an African Cultural Day, and I was invited. And I went, and it was great. It was like I would never have thought to have gone myself because I wouldn't have thought that that was an event designed for me. But I was invited and I went, And I had a brilliant time. I took my son along, and I saw women that I knew already in a different kind of environment where they were really relaxed and articulating their voice in a different about different things in different ways, and it helped me to get some of them to get to know some of them much better and see them in a different light. So yeah, I mean, I feel like saying that out loud, it feels like a bit of a silly example because it sort of feels too simple. But I think when we are really busy people, which we are increasingly, um, um, going out of our way to put ourselves in environments and situations where we wouldn't ordinarily be is a big effort. So I don't think we should underestimate the simplicity of putting ourselves in different situations where we can hear different voices in
Great.
formal
Um, I
environment.
I don't know if it's my internet sort of failing a bit, but thank you so much, Alice, and obviously, and everybody else for your time, because time is precious, as we know. But I hope that was kind of useful for everyone, and obviously get in touch. I'm sure Alice will be happy to hear directly, and get in touch with me as well, and happy to talk about anything further.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank
Thanks,
you very
Joe.
much, Alice.